it is critical that you romance your wife, and then so that way you can keep her from emotionally checking out and not getting bored, and keep her from resenting you. And then the other thing that I would offer up, the reason why you should romance your wife, to prevent her from withholding from you. And yes, that could be withholding sex, because sex seems to be the thing that gets ransomed. Hey, if you want sex, you better do this. And that's how some wives work, right? Not all wives. I won't classify all wives like that, but many wives, they withhold sex. And for most men, sex is one of those things that we value really, really high in the marriage. You are listening to the Husband Coach's Corner, the podcast designed to teach husbands how to love their wife each and every day and become better men in the process. I'm your host, Chris Scott, and welcome back to another episode. Welcome back to another episode here on the Husband Coach's Corner. Today, we're going to be talking about romance and compassion. Now, before we dive into that, if you are looking for one-on-one coaching, or you just want to see what coaching is all about when it comes to marriage, then go over to marriagedrills.com or check the description box for the link to sign up for a free consult. We'll develop a game plan that's specific for you. And I think most of the men that I'm working with right now, they really do appreciate it. So if that's something you're interested in, check that out. So let's go ahead and dive into today's content. I think it's important that we unpack what romance and compassion are. So when we're talking about it in this episode today, you understand where I'm coming from, and you can kind of start to piece that together for your marriage. So let's go ahead and go over the definition of compassion first. So when I say compassion, I'm talking about the understanding and concern for the suffering or distress of your wife. All right. Let me say that one more time, and maybe in a slightly different way. Compassion is an understanding and concern for the suffering or distress conditions of your wife. So you're going to be understanding, you're going to be concerned, you're going to be paying attention and aware of what your wife is going through. That is what compassion is. It's really just a sense of awareness. All right. Now, I do want to give a disclaimer before we even go into compassion, that when I talk about compassion, it is not greater than empathy. I think you need both in order to love your wife. Now, I have an episode earlier in the season that talked about empathy. So if that's something you're interested in, just go check that out. And I'll leave the link in the description, so it makes it a little bit easier for you to find. Now, when we talk about romance, what I'm talking about here is the feeling of excitement and mystery associated with love. All right. The feeling of excitement and mystery associated with love. Like you should be doing something that brings excitement to your wife and to your marriage, but also a little bit of mystery, like what is he going to do next, right? These are the two definitions that we're going to be unpacking in today's episode, but I just wanted to define those up front, so that way when you get into the content, you can kind of picture, okay, compassion is really just a sense of awareness, making sure that I'm being understanding and I know what's going on with my wife, where romance is one of those things where you're diving into doing something and it's bringing excitement and a level of interest to the marriage, as we'll find out. So let's start with the big R word, romance. Now, this is one of those things where a lot of people, we get touchy-feely and we're like, oh, romance. And I really think the movie industry has tarnished what romance could look like inside of a marriage, or what romance actually is in marriage, because we think that you have to do these grand gestures. And I'm not giving any man, myself included, a pass on these grand gestures that our wives, they truly do deserve from us, right? But at the same time, maybe that's just not what's working in your marriage. Maybe that's something that doesn't come natural to you. So when you try to do these grand gestures, you fall flat on your face. It's not reciprocated in love. It doesn't bring that excitement or mystery. And in fact, in some cases, it could bring a sense of friction and tension in the marriage because your wife doesn't appreciate it. You think you're doing a good job. You see where I'm going with that. All right. So let's talk about bringing that excitement and mystery of romance in your marriage in a genuine way that meets whatever it is that you do in your marriage, right? It should be who you are as a person. Everything that you do should not be, I'm changing my personality or my character. I mean, I guess we can modify our character, right, if it's for the better. But your personality is innately who you are, and that's who your wife married. Now, there are some things that maybe we can grow on our personality as we grow older and more mature, but not something that we need to discuss in today's episode. So when we start talking about romance, the importance of it, right? It keeps your wife interested in you. It is critical that your wife stays interested in you. I think that's a very straightforward and one of those things where you probably get what I'm saying when I say it keeps your wife interested in you. Now, if you don't want to have a boring marriage, it is highly recommended that you romance your wife. All right. And don't worry, we're going to talk about some examples of romance here in a second. The other reason that romance is important in your marriage is it shows your wife that you are intentional about loving her. It shows your wife that you are intentional about loving her. Think about how important that is, that your wife knows that you are being intentional of showing her love. One, that's the reason why it's the tagline of this show, that we find ways to love our wife every day, right? But when you show your wife romantic gestures, there's no one else, and guys, hear me, there is no one else that should be receiving the type of romantic gesture that your wife is receiving from you. All right. If you are performing these romantic acts for another woman, you are missing the mark. All right. So knock that off. So this is another reason that romance is so important, because you are the only person that should be giving this to your wife, and that you are, and your wife is the only person that should be receiving this from you. So it instantly develops an intimate relationship or an intimate connection with your wife, even outside of the sexual, physical, intimate connection that most men associate romance with, right? Let's not fall into that trap. Now, the alternatives to not romancing your wife, right? I have a few items here, and I'm sure this list can go a lot longer, especially for all the women who are listening. But the first one is she may resent you, all right? If you want to build a deeper, more meaningful relationship, romancing your wife is so important that if you don't do it, you run the risk of her resenting you. And guys, I can speak from a level of experience on this. I am not the most romantic person. In fact, I am probably the least romantic person. And my wife knows that about me. That's one of our big marital things that we are working on developing for ourselves, or at least I'm working on providing that to her. But just keep that in mind. Romancing your wife may, or not romancing your wife, may lead to more resentment. The next thing, she may get bored of the marriage. And guys, if your wife gets bored of the marriage, you're going to run into some issues where your wife may adventure outside of the marriage, or she will do the next thing, which is emotionally check out. And if she emotionally checks out, her emotions have to go somewhere, right? Depending on how your wife's morals and characters are, those emotions may just get bottled up, and it becomes more fuel for that resentment. And then you start to have these friction and these like really nasty interactions with your wife, and they're not beneficial to your marriage in any way, shape, or form. So it is critical that you romance your wife, and then so that way you can keep her from emotionally checking out and not getting bored, and keep her from resenting you. And then the other thing that I would offer up, the reason why you should romance your wife, to prevent her from withholding from you. And yes, that could be withholding sex, because sex seems to be the thing that gets ransomed. Hey, if you want sex, you better do this. And that's how some wives work, right? Not all wives. I won't classify all wives like that, but many wives, they withhold sex. And for most men, sex is one of those things that we value really, really high in the marriage. So if you don't want to be withheld, and I'm not talking on just sex, right? It could be being withheld from a meal. It could be withheld from emotional connection, deeper, meaningful conversations. There could be all kinds of things that you are going to miss out on or be withheld from, whatever you want to phrase that as, if you choose not to romance. So now that we understand what it is and the importance of it, let's talk about some ways that you can actually romance your wife. All right. Now, I will recommend that the frequency of this is at least once per week. You romance your wife in some way, shape, or form. And then you do a larger gesture that is appropriate for your relationship and the season of life that you're in once per month. And then once per quarter, or once every 3 months, you should do a grand gesture. And then maybe, and really not maybe, the quarter that your anniversary is in, you should tie your grand gesture to that. Okay. So like my anniversary with my wife is in June. The grand gesture that I would do for the 3 months, March through June, would probably be in June, because that's our anniversary. It makes it easier for me, right? So I don't have to do it more frequently. Now, once a month, we'll do a larger thing like dinner, out, candlelit, stuff like that, right? Where she gets dressed up a little bit, and it's just the two of us, and we get to just chill and hang out. And, you know, I show that I have a collected plan, because if you have plans, there's actually a funny TikTok. I think I shared this on the channel before, or on the podcast before, that if you tell your wife you have plans, it excites her instantly. And I think that's there's some truth to that, right? You say, hey, I got plans, and it's like, what? You do? And yeah, I think most women will reciprocate positivity to that, and you will definitely win some brownie points. Now, some other things that you can do. All right, now that we know the frequency, bring home flowers randomly. This is a thing that I don't do nearly often enough, right? Because this episode is for me just as much as it is for the men that listen to this, because I struggle in the romance department. But every time that I brought home flowers, my wife gets extremely excited. I bring that mystery and excitement that I'm talking about in the definition of romancing, or the importance of romancing, right? So just bringing home some flowers can be a game changer for you. Now, the next thing is you can send a love note or a text message. Send a love note, a text message, and if you can put it in the mail, all right? Now, I haven't personally done that. Or at least not since we've been married, and maybe I will do that for my wife. Hopefully she's not listening to this episode, and then she'll know. But either way, she doesn't know when it's coming. So it brings that excitement and mystery. Like, what will Chris do next to show me intentionally that he loves me? right? That's what you want to get your wife to thinking, because that brings a level of excitement to the marriage, and it gets away from that mundane and dull thing. And if you're doing it in a genuine way that reflects who you are as a person, or at least meeting your wife in a way that she appreciates and can tie into, you're going to be golden. All right. You're going to be golden. So send the love note, text message, or you can write it out by hand. And if you don't want to put it in the mail, you can just drop it off somewhere where she'll intentionally see it. So like tape it to the bathroom mirror, put it on top of her pillow when she goes to work or something like that. I don't know. So that way when she comes home, she finds it, and it's an unexpected thing, right? You are unexpectedly surprising her and showing her that you love her and that you care for her. So that is the second one. The third one, leave a love note around the house. Now, this is a little bit different than the one that I just offered up. Those love notes can be like on sticky notes, and you just tap them down somewhere, right? Or you can put them on a index card and put those in random places, hopefully somewhere where they won't get destroyed. And those love notes could be a line from her favorite poem, or a poem that reminds you of her. And you can just let her know, like, hey, I was reading this poem, or this poem reminds me of you. And if you're not into poetry, don't do it, right? That's not a thing. Like if you know, like, poetry is not your thing, then don't do it, because you're being a fake person if you're trying to do something that just doesn't fit your personality. But I'm an artist, I'm creative, I like to write, so poetry works for me, right? When my wife reads it, it will be received well, and she would know that this is my way of genuinely showing her love and romancing her in that capacity. Now, another thing you can do is take her to a fancy restaurant. Now, I already talked about this, but when I was writing my notes for this episode, I was thinking a fancy restaurant where she, like, 5-course meal type restaurant. Now, do this if it's within your budget financially. Like, don't break the bank, all right? But if you can't go to a fancy restaurant where it's like 5-course meal, and maybe this is one of those grand gestures, like once a quarter or once a month type deal, then maybe you can do something where you go to a restaurant that requires you to make reservations, that maybe isn't so fancy, or you can even just make reservations. In fact, there's a gentleman that I go to church with, one of the pastors actually, at the church I attend. He took his wife out for an anniversary dinner, and on the table there were flowers. Now, no other table, and the way he tells the story just makes me laugh, no other table in the restaurant had flowers. Now, this wasn't like the top of the line, super fancy, fine dining cuisine type restaurant, but his table had flowers in honor of their anniversary. So, and he coordinated that. It was unexpected, and it was a mystery, or it was, it was a mysterious thing. Like, what else will my husband do? And that's the point that I'm trying to make. And hopefully that drove home. So, we'll move on to compassion, because I think this is where a lot of men are going to have the challenge of understanding, because it doesn't necessarily come natural to us to be compassionate. But hopefully after today's episode, you will be encouraged, inspired to go out and be more compassionate towards your wife, especially if you know that your wife is hurting. Now, shameless plug, I do help a lot of men through identifying compassionate opportunities for their wives, and then that leads them into a deeper connection so that they can be empathetic. So if that's something you're interested in, please sign up for a one-on-one consult, and I will walk you through that. So again, I do have to give the disclaimer. Compassion is not greater than empathy. Okay. Empathy is you are going through the thing with your wife. Compassion is simply you understand and acknowledge that your wife is going through something, and you're going to be patient, loving, caring, kind, gentle, peaceful, and you're going to create some space for her to live out her emotional challenges, her emotional distress, whatever that may be in the moment. That's what you're offering to your wife when I talk about compassion. Now, some of the practical ways, right? Because we already got the definition that we are aware, understanding, and supportive of our wife. So some of the practical ways of implementing compassion is you stop yelling or speaking in aggressive tones. There are many men that I observe just, living life, that they yell at their wives in public. And it confuses me, because it's like, okay, if this is how you're treating your wife in public, how are you treating her in private? Now, there are a ton, that's not me like judging that marriage, but it does make me ask the question, like, do I treat my wife like that? And how would my wife reciprocate? Okay. I guarantee you there are very few wives across the world, if any, that appreciate being yelled at or spoken to in an aggressive tone. Our wives want us to talk to them in a loving, gentle way, especially when they're going through some challenges and some issues. All right. So my recommendation is that you take some time to identify if you talk very loudly to your wife. And as I've heard some men call it, I just talk really loud at my wife, or to my wife. And, I think it will be perceived as yelling from, third parties, to include your wife. So just food for thought on that. But if you're speaking in an aggressive tone, saying things really harshly or really sternly to your wife, that is also not showing compassion towards her. But if you speak more gentle and peaceful and loving, even when you're frustrated, this is something that I am practicing. When I get frustrated with my wife, I take a second and then I respond with a more gentle approach. And I'll be honest, it's not easy, but it is a way for me to be more compassionate, because sometimes she's upset about something that she's going through. Okay. Another way of being practical about compassion is remove sarcastic tones from your speech when you're talking to your wife. Now, that goes along the same lines as removing aggressive speech, but sarcasm, sometimes it is not received the way that you think it is in your mind. Your wife may receive it differently, and that can lead to a world of problems. So I don't recommend sarcasm in any relationship, especially a marriage relationship. But I'm also one of those guys, I want to be received well when I communicate something. So that's just my personal take. I don't use sarcasm in my personal life most of the time, to the best of my knowledge, at least. Now, always seek to gain understanding on matters that are confusing in your marriage. Now, we've talked about this before, but the best way to be compassionate is to first identify that you don't know everything, and that you need to take some time to get to hear your wife. I'm not going to go super deep into this because I have a complete episode on understanding our wives and the importance of understanding our wives. So definitely go take a listen to that if you're like, you know what, I need to get better understanding. But the point here is you should always be asking questions about a situation, so that way you can understand more of what your wife is going through, instead of assuming you know what she's going through and then stepping on your own toes and putting your foot in your mouth, so to speak, because that's not being compassionate. But when you learn to understand what she's going through, you will find the natural way of being a loving, caring, gentle husband to her. The next thing that you can do is allow your wife time to be emotional. Create a safe space for her to express herself. And I've already talked about that briefly in this episode, but what I really want to hit home here is you have to create an opportunity and a environment for your wife to be comfortable with the fact that she may have to be vulnerable. If your wife can't be vulnerable with you and she doesn't have anyone that she can tell what's going on in her life to, then what's going to happen to all of those emotions, right? Our wives have emotions, and if she can't share them with you, then who else will she share them with? Who else? There are many times that I just let my wife clear the air, and she rants. Sometimes it's about me. Sometimes it's about other people. She just has to get things out. And I understand why women need to have that space or that opportunity, but it's not something that I personally do, right? But for a man who wants to be compassionate towards their wife, you have to create a safe space so that way they can act out on their emotions, or at least express them in a safe environment, free of judgment, things of that sort. And then the last thing that I'll offer for compassion is support your wife on hard things that she is doing in her life. If your wife is training for a marathon, support her in that. I'm not saying to go run alongside her, unless that's something you're into, but support her in whatever the challenge is. So maybe that's, hey, you know what? I'll rub your feet because feet get sore when you run, right? Or, hey, you know what? How about I drive you to this park where you like to run? And, you're being supportive, right? But also, maybe she's going through some emotionally hard times with a family member, brother, sister, aunt, uncle, mother, father, a friend even. Be supportive to your wife in those situations as well, just by simply saying, hey, I'm here to talk if you need. And that's a very easy way. And don't try to fix the problem. All right. Don't try to fix the problem. Hear what she says and then say, oh, okay. I can understand how that's a thing. And then you keep asking these understanding questions, right? That's the best way to be supportive to your wife. So there you have it, romance and compassion. Hopefully you see the synergy between the two. One, you are bringing excitement and energy into the relationship, where the other, you're being more aware and understanding. Both of these go hand in hand, especially when you start trying to make connections on an intimate level, because if you are not bringing a level of excitement to the marriage, then how are you going to connect in that way? But then the other side is if you're not being aware of opportunities where you can connect, right? Then you will find yourself coming up short on a regular basis. If you know that your wife is having some challenges in certain areas, then you can romance her in those areas where you show her love, you bring her love in a very genuine way. I keep saying the word genuine in a genuine way because there's a level of importance when it comes to loving your wife in a genuine way. All right. And it just doesn't come natural for a lot of people. But hopefully this episode resonated and you start to see how you can be more romantic with your wife and being more observant and gaining more understanding so you can be compassionate, which leads to more opportunities to be romantic, and you can find those ways to love her. I think that's a better way of saying all of that and concluding today's episode. Now, I did mention I am personally working on the romance side of this. So guys, I understand. I truly do. I truly understand the challenge if you struggle with being romantic. All right. I truly do understand that challenge, but that doesn't give us the right or the opportunity to avoid being romantic. So I'll leave it there. And for the next week, I want you guys to find a way to love your wife every day. Peace.